Number 1. Walking home. I've been pretty fortunate to always have been able to work from home. Even long before the whole COVID lockdown changed things so much. I've always been able to keep my own hours too, and this was helpful to me because I was a night person. So I would often keep up all night and go to sleep during the day. This really fit my personality because I'm not really a people person. I mean, I like people, don't get me wrong, but I'm sort of awkward around people and just prefer to spend time by myself. Being like this, I often went out at night to get things too. There was a convenience store a little ways outside of my neighborhood that I liked to go to often. It was a liquor store, I guess, but they sold a whole lot of other things than alcohol. This took place during the winter time, and it was actually snowing pretty hard outside. I was wanting something to keep my energy up, so I decided to run down to the convenience store and get myself an energy drink. It was late at night, but I can't recall exactly how late. But due to both the time and the falling snow, it was completely dead outside. I always liked hearing the sound of my feet crunching in the new snow when I walked. But when I had left, I hadn't expected the snow to be falling as hard as it was. There was very little visibility outside. Fortunately, there wasn't anyone driving out, so I could walk on the side of the road without worrying too much. When I got to the store, I noticed someone was standing outside of the store, smoking a cigarette. I gave them the friendly wave that everyone in my town gave each other, which was returned, and then went into the store. I got me a Sobe Orange Tsunami, which was my drink of choice at the time. And when I went to pay for it, I noticed that there was a new worker behind the counter. I greeted him, made some polite chat about how I had been coming to the store for years, and how the owners are nice, and that I will probably be seeing a lot of him, since I shop there often. He seemed like a really nice guy. When I left the store, the guy who was smoking was still there. As I got about a block away from the store, I turned and noticed that the guy was walking in my direction. I got that sort of nervous feeling that I always get when I notice something like that. Remember, people generally make me nervous, and nervousness usually makes me assume that someone is following me, even when they most likely are not. I turned off the road in town, into the subdivision that I lived in. When I had gotten a block into it, I once again felt compelled to turn around. I just wanted to see if the guy was still following me. I mean, I didn't know if he was intentionally following me, I guess. But either way, I wanted to check. And he was. My nervousness increased just a bit. I had a little bit more to walk before I could get home. I started walking just a little bit faster. I had 2 more streets to turn down, and I would check and see if he was following me down them as well. When I made the next turn and got a block down it, I checked, and yeah, he had turned too. It was beginning to seem like less of a coincidence, so I hurried a little more. I only checked back once in a while, and tried to make it seem casual, but he must have sped up too because he was continuously only a block behind me. He kept keeping pace with me, but didn't try to catch up with me. Finally, I turned down my own street, and the pattern repeated itself once again. My mind was now turning in many different directions, wondering if he was really following me, and if he was, why did he keep lagging a block behind? When I got to my yard, I sort of trotted up the driveway and got into my house quickly. Going in and then looking out the window, I saw him standing a little way down the street. He had stopped walking and looked like he was talking to somebody on his mobile phone. I got an idea then. I had a dog at the time, a pit bull. Now, I will tell you that the dog, Randy, was the biggest cuddle monster of all time. I doubt he would even hurt a kitten if he had the opportunity. but people saw pit bulls and were very often afraid of them, so I thought I would just let the dog out in the front yard as a sort of warning. You know, just in case the guy was planning on robbing my house or something like that. When I took the dog out, I could tell the man was obviously startled. He wasn't on his phone anymore, and he continued walking. He gave me a wave as he went by, and he walked past my house, down the street, and turned off into another street. The whole thing was really weird, and I didn't know what to think about it, but I was happy that my dog ploy had scared the guy away. The next day I was watching the news. I can't believe how long it has been since I actually watched the news on TV, rather than read it online. I got the shock of my life. The liquor store that I had visited had been robbed that night. The owner had been beaten up very badly and was found laying behind the counter. And that made me think of the person I thought was the new cashier. Maybe he was actually a robber who was pretending. And I wondered if the owner, an old man I'd known for quite a while, had been laying behind the counter when I was there. Well, I contacted the police about it. They had picked someone up and wanted to know if I could identify them. It was the cashier and the man who followed me home. They had robbed the store and beaten up the owner. It then occurred to me that maybe he had followed me home with the intent on robbing me too. And although I felt really bad for that kind old man, I felt really, really appreciative of my dog Randy. If he hadn't scared the guy off. Number 2. At home. I've had some pretty messed up experiences involving my family in the past. I guess it would be safe to say that there was a lot of dysfunction in my extended family. But one night, when I was visiting one of my aunt's houses, the worst of all these experiences happened. My mom had 2 sisters, and their children and us, we sort of grew up like we were siblings instead of cousins. I was the second oldest cousin at the time, but when this particular story takes place, I was the oldest of the kids who were involved in it. So my mom took me and my younger brother, and we drove out to my aunt's house. She lived a pretty decent drive out in the country in West Virginia, and the thought was that we were going to spend a few days there. My other aunt lived pretty close to that area too, so when she found out that we were going to visit, she decided to come along too. At the time I was 14 years old. I think that it's kind of important to know that. My younger brother was 9. The other cousin at the house was the one that lived there, and he was 12 years old at the time. So apparently they wanted to go out to the bars, so they bought us some frozen pizzas and rented us some movies to watch while they went out. My mom wasn't really much of a drinker, but she liked to go along for the fun. None of the 3 parents were married at the time, but my Aunt Claire, not the one whose house we went to, but the other one, had this on-again, off-again, tumultuous relationship with a guy named Jack. I knew that she and Jack would often get drunk here and there and would have these really outrageous fights. Fortunately, I had never witnessed any of them before. I really hated to see adults fighting, so I was glad about this. At the time, I wasn't really good at confrontation with others. So they went out, and they were out for quite a while. The 2 younger kids went to bed eventually, and us 2 older ones stayed up to watch the scary movie that the adults had rented for us. I was still sort of at the age where a movie could still scare me, so I was a little scared while watching the movie. And no, I don't remember what it was. What happened during the rest of the night was much more memorable than the movie was. The phone started ringing, and my cousin, since he lived there, went and answered it. He told me that it was my mom and she needed to talk to me. On the phone with my mom, she told me that my Aunt Claire had left the bar for a short time, but had told her sister that she would be back. She had never returned to the bar, though. Jack, however, had called the bar, seeing if Claire was there. She then asked me if I had seen or heard from Claire at all, and I let her know that I hadn't. So the last thing she tells me is that if Claire shows up at the house at any point, and if Jack shows up later, don't let him know that she is there. And I said okay, already dreading the possibilities that this could bring up. I went back to the living room, now filled with dread and apprehension of what might happen later in the night. And it wasn't too long before my Aunt Claire got to the house and knocked on the door, since it was locked. I went to let her in. She was extremely intoxicated, and looked like she had been in a fight. I immediately thought that Jack must have beaten her up or something, and got even more freaked out. She went into my other aunt's room to lay down. She didn't want me to call the police or anything like that. I didn't really know what to do, so I just did what I had been told. I let her go to sleep, and then went back to the movie. About 15 minutes later, I heard a pounding at the door. My heart skipped a beat when I thought it had to be Jack, and I wondered what I could do. I figured that I had to answer the door because he knew that we were there. So I went to the door and opened it, and indeed it was Jack at the door. He asked me if Claire was there. He seemed really, really angry, and I was really, really nervous. However, I did my best to keep my cool, and I told him that she wasn't. He asked if I had heard anything from my mom and my aunt, and I told him no. I noticed in the light that his hand was wrapped up with a bandana, and immediately thought that he must have heard it, hitting her or something. He was a big guy, and I was very scared that he was going to come into the trailer on his own to look around, and just kept expecting it. Right about then, thank God, my mom and aunt arrived in her car. They told me to get into the house and close the door. I did what I was told, but was still pretty scared of what might happen. It was only a few moments later when I heard a gunshot go off, and that nearly made me mess myself. I was worried that Jack might have shot my mom or my aunt, but then I heard my aunt yelling at him to get lost, or her next shot wouldn't be a warning shot. After a few moments, my mom and aunt came into the house. I shouldn't have been surprised that my aunt kept a rifle in her car. That was the sort of thing that my family did. I was, however, a bit worried when they took my other aunt to the hospital. They told me to keep the doors locked and use the gun if Jack came back. I'd shot a gun a few times, and I didn't really like it. Fortunately, though, Jack never came back, and I didn't have to use it. For a while, though, I was pretty scared. Number 3. The Arrival. I had just finished one of my best touring days since I left Daly City, California. I clocked 160 miles in 7 hours, so I was pretty psyched when I decided to stop off early to do my yoga, eat my power food, and bathe in the Pacific Ocean just north of Ventura. It was early March, so the water was unusually warm at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The unseasonably warm ocean temperatures, El Niño, had run into the cold subarctic currents coming down from the north for the second year in a row, generating massive storm systems, unusual weather patterns, gale-force winds, and gusts of up to 60 knots. This freak phenomenon lasted for the rest of the entire trip that spring, and accompanied me nearly all the way to San Diego, before I turned east on the I-10 to cross the Pacific coastals, the Sonoran Desert, and into Tucson, Arizona. My average distance till then had been about 80 miles a day, and I was on my 10th day of the tour. I had to keep reminding myself this wasn't a race, but a continuation of a kind of soul search expedition that had begun some months earlier on Mount Diablo, go on to Yosemite National Park, and then on my road trip south, down the California coast to Tijuana, Mexico, back to San Diego, California, and from there to Tucson, Arizona. Because my love of the ocean went back to where I was born in Florida and baptized in the Atlantic Ocean some 2,300 miles away, bike touring along the Pacific Ocean was like finally going home again. We'd moved from Florida when I was 3, and despite repeated attempts, running away as a child, road trips, vacations, etc., I had never actually made it back. My routine was to pedal for 8 straight hours, pitch camp, do yoga, eat, swim, and then meditate facing the setting sun while mentally recalling everything I'd done that day and opening myself to whatever was to follow. It was what I had been doing since striking out from Mount Diablo some months earlier. My transport was a then new 1983 Univega Gran Turismo, an 18-gear aluminum alloy frame touring bike. I'd bought at REI in Berkeley, California, the previous summer. I equipped it with front-low rider and rear ultralight bicycle racks, and panniers that housed my tools, maps, changes of clothing, food. In the Gore-Tex-lined bivy sack and North Face down bag I used as shelter in Yosemite, I left my North Face backpack with a friend in Oakland. The entire set weighed just over 24 pounds, and after my previous 11-week survival in the Sierra Nevadas, I was down to a lean 183 pounds. My fuel was Native American spirit guide-inspired food, consisting of raw fruit and vegetables, dried fruit, cheese, turkey, ham, and pita that I'd had a vision of one night in a Miwok cave while on survival in Yosemite National Park the previous winter. Highway 1, or the Pacific Coast Highway, or Pac Highway, and California Highway 101 described almost the entire length of the trip, proving to be a mass of switchbacks and S-curves, replete with washouts and detours. I'd no sooner tack along a 2 or 3 mile S-curve with a 30 to 40 knot headwind, gusting to 50, then I'd jibe along with a 2 or 3 mile tailwind, with 0 to no tail speed at all. All the way down the coast, it was a perpetual contest of push and lull, like kayaking the neaps and ebbs at high tide. After leaving Yosemite, I picked up the gear I'd stored with a friend back in Oakland for the second half of my tour, and after a few days of rest and eating, I took the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, to the end of the line at Daly City, and began my coastal tour south down Highway 1. It was March, so the cold water coming down from the Arctic could have pushed the California grays, the orcas and great whites, along with the porpoises and sea lions and albatross, down to the Baja, 1,200 miles to the south. But I'd already seen a gray breach in Monterey Bay just a few weeks back, so I knew the weather and the wildlife were both out of whack. Spotting my gear in a safe place well above the tide line, I decided it was time to swim out and use my makeshift camp, the shoreline, and the setting sun as reference points. Because of the numerous signs indicating riptides, I had to change, and I entered the water a couple of times. After breaking through a particularly hard surf, I was able to swim under and over the crests, and then negotiate the 10 to 15 foot swells coming in off the deep ocean. After that, it was simply a matter of paying attention to the cold, hypothermia, and keeping my reference points in view, while treading the choppy crests and troughs of the open ocean. A big part of freestyle in deep water, without mask, fins, or snorkel, is keeping an eye on any reference point you've decided to return to. A good way to do that is by walking out towards the water, and before entering, looking back and committing that image to memory. Swimming out, turning around again, and respotting your new reference point, committing that to memory, and so on. Because water is static, changing all the time. Doing this over and over, especially in unknown water or terrain, is essential. It creates a series of still images in your mind from which you can pull from, where you started, how far you progressed, and where you hope to end up, should you become disoriented. Returning would be the reverse. It's the same thing you do when hiking in woods or mountains or deserts that you're unfamiliar with. GPS was almost unheard of back then. Also, whenever I found myself too far out where my reference point was no longer visible, I bring up other, larger visual reminders, like a pier, a jetty, or a group of trees, houses, etc., that would broaden my original starting point to encompass about 1/4 to 1/2 a visual mile. Because El Nino had raised the water temperature and with it the ambient air temperature by almost 7 degrees, the effort was stronger than average wind currents on the surface, and unusually strong and unpredictable rip currents beneath, so I knew I had to be especially mindful when swimming out and back. After deciding it was time to go back, I discovered that I could no longer clearly make out my original reference point, my bicycle and gear, and my second reference point, a large white building, possibly a hotel, was disappearing fast. Some low stratus clouds have moved in, obscuring the sun and what little glare it afforded on the aluminum frame of my bicycle. The surface tailwinds I'd enjoyed earlier, that had helped to push me out, had increased the near-gale force winds as it got closer to sundown, making it much harder on the return, blowing between 35 to 40 knots against. The waves had increased to near 12-foot crests with 8-foot troughs, and the tide was not only pulling me further out, but further north from where I started out, and potentially out towards the open ocean. Getting dangerously close to the continental shelf, the water almost black, I took all this into account and found a strange calm come over me. I wasn't so much afraid as I was eager to face and accept whatever was to come. I slowly turned to pull myself around to face the shore, and calmly began my return by going under the wind and the surface current to where the water was, in its counterclockwise circular motion, gradually flowing toward the shore. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. I'd surface, like the sea otter, just long enough to take in air and swim back down, about 8 to 12 feet, to catch the shoreward current and ride it for as long as my air could last. This seemed to be working even though my starting point was now further to the south of where I'd started, and the shoreline had receded inland, making it further I had to go to get back. Nonetheless, I continued swimming down deep enough to feel the counterpull that would carry me closer to shore when the rip current I had been trying to avoid suddenly came into play. Now when I would go down below the outbound surface current to where the current was pushing in the direction of the shore, the rip would pull me down even deeper into the water. I would skim dangerously close to the bottom, sometimes feeling like it was deliberately holding me down, and I would have to counter that effect by staying on the surface longer, swimming against the wind and the current just to get enough air to resubmerge, swimming deeper to resume my shoreward direction, when the rushing deep water current would sometimes shove me all the way down onto the bottom. It felt like the crashing surf on the surface coming down with the full force of a 10 or 15-foot wave. I was reminded of one of my earliest memories as a child in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, with the tide coming in and the surf slamming me down, lifting me back up with the froth, and then slamming me back down again onto the snow-white sand and rocks, leaving me coughing and sputtering and crying for my mother. I was about 3 then. Gradually I learned how to hold on to rocks while down on all fours, closing my eyes and holding my breath until the wave had passed, and then inching my way back to the safety of the shore to do it all over again as soon as I'd recovered. As I got used to the rhythm of this awesome force of nature, I made an interesting discovery. When I'd hit the bottom, I noticed that there was no sand, only rocks, as you'd see on a river bottom where the current was strongest. Further out in deeper water, the rocks were large and jagged, but the closer I got to the shore, they became smaller and smoother like river rocks. This reassured me because I knew I had a path and I was headed in the right direction. Little by little I maintained my forward motion with brief lulls between, even though sometimes it was all I could do to keep enough air in my lungs. When the rip decided to body slam me particularly hard off the bottom, as though trying to force out what little air I had left and drown me where I was, and yet sometimes I barely felt it at all. I thought it was because I was either so caught up in the primordial struggle with the most powerful force in nature, or the temperature of the water had made me numb. Either way, I soon discovered rocks and shells and plants tracing the edges of the rock pattern on the bottom, like it was a path going through someone's garden. For those brief moments I had examined some of the contents in the fading light, feeling their shape and contour, porous or rigidity in my hands and fingers, and wonder at the simple genius of their making, while gathering myself together before the next pull or need for oxygen took me back to the surface to do it all over again, leaving me awed and exhilarated at the same time. When I finally emerged onto dry land, I discovered that I was nearly a mile further north of where I'd started. It was then that the seriousness of my condition and the circumstance I'd been in finally occurred to me. I remember the last hard slam not 20 feet out from where I eventually washed up, in the extreme undertow yanking me in the opposite direction. It proved to be the most difficult part I had endured, trying to get my benumbed feet up and out of the sand and rocks. The rip had covered me with almost to the knees. It was like trudging through a bog with your boots full of mud and water. I'd no sooner get one foot free than the other would be sucked down and held into place like a vice. It took the last bit of strength I had to finally get free. I remembered the phrase, "The sea is a jealous mistress." Half stumbling, erect, yet humbled, with the solid ground finally under my feet, I looked back to where I could still make out the buoy I had swum past about a quarter-mile out. Miles ago, I thought. Once clear, I remember looking up, with the now setting sun on my back, and seeing a little girl who come out to meet me. At first she seemed happy, but then she started to cry, pointing at me and calling to her mother. And then there were suddenly all these people asking me if I was all right, and whether I needed some water or a ride to the hospital. This was before cell phones. They appeared wide-eyed and inquisitive, with looks of shock and pity, and I just standing there, oblivious, trying to figure out what they were on about. And finally I followed their eyes down to my feet and legs and stomach and arms and hands, and realized I was completely covered in blood. Carefully I brushed my hands across my face and brow through my hair, and realized that I was bleeding all over. Self-conscious and a little embarrassed, I thanked everyone for their kindness and sympathy, and reassured them, especially the little girl, that I was okay, and turned to walk unsteadily in the direction of where I hoped my bicycle and gear still were. I must have looked like some half-human thing, hobbling down the beach. The crowd followed uncertainly for some distance before thinning out and eventually going their separate ways. I re-entered the water numerous times to wash off the blood, thinking I was glad there weren't any great whites in the area. I joked they probably didn't have any more taste for a cold fool than they did for cold water. When I got back to where it all begun, everything was exactly where I'd left it. Even the gulls had left my stuff untouched. I knew then I was indeed favored by the sea goddess. I decided against camping on the beach and found a motel room and showered and just slept and healed for a couple of days. Naturally, I replayed everything that had happened over and over in my mind until I finally realized that I'd come full circle. I'd finally arrived some 2,300 miles from where it had all started, 29 years before, in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Home. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.